She buried her husband on a Tuesday, and by Thursday, the bank had already taken the house. Nobody in Cedar Hollow offered her a roof, a meal, or a kind word. They just watched her walk out of town with a single trunk and nowhere to go. What they didn't know, what nobody knew, was that $2 in an abandoned trading post were about to change everything she thought she understood about her husband's family. Her name was Eleanor Hayes, and at 21, she had already buried more than most women buried in a lifetime. She had married Thomas Hayes 2 years earlier, against the quiet disapproval of his family, who had wanted a different kind of match for the only grandson left to carry the Hayes name. Eleanor had no land, no inheritance, no family of standing behind her, only a sharp mind, steady hands, and a willingness to work that Thomas had loved and his relatives had never quite forgiven her for. For a while, it hadn't mattered. Thomas ran a small freight operation out of Cedar Hollow, hauling goods between the railhead and the outlying ranches, and the two of them had built a modest, contented life together, in a rented house at the edge of town. Eleanor had let herself believe, for those 2 years, that she had finally found solid ground. Then the fever came through in early spring, the kind that moved fast and showed no mercy, and within 11 days Thomas was gone. What followed was worse than the grief itself. Thomas, it turned out, had quietly borrowed against their small home to cover a bad season in the freight business. Debts Eleanor never knew existed until the bank's man arrived on her porch 2 days after the funeral, papers in hand, his expression carefully blank, in the way of men who did this often enough to no longer feel it. By Thursday, the house was gone. She went, out of desperation more than hope, to the Hayes family, Thomas's aunt, his uncle Robert, the cousins who had sat stiffly through her wedding without ever quite warming to her. She did not ask for charity. She asked only for a few weeks, enough time to find work, find a room, find some footing. She was given none of it. "You were Thomas's wife," his aunt told her, not unkindly, but with a finality that left no room for argument. "You were never truly Hayes' family, dear. I think it's best we all move forward separately now." Robert Hayes, at least, had the decency to avoid her eyes when he said it. So Eleanor packed the one trunk she had left, 2 dresses, a few coins, Thomas's pocket watch, and nothing else, and walked out of the only home she had known as a married woman, with the whole of Cedar Hollow watching from behind curtains and porch rails, offering nothing. It was 3 days later, sitting in the county clerk's office, trying to understand what little remained of her legal standing, that she heard the name that changed everything. "Hayes Trading Posts coming up for auction Friday," the clerk said to his assistant, barely looking up from his ledger. "Taxes unpaid going on 6 years now. Starting bid's $2, and I doubt even that draws a bidder." Eleanor went very still. "The Hayes Trading Post," she repeated. "Out past the creek bend?" The clerk glanced at her, recognition flickering, and then settling into something close to pity. "That's the one. Silas Hayes's old place. Thomas's grandfather, wasn't it? Building's been empty since before the railroad came through. Nothing out there but rot and rats, far as anyone knows." The Hayes name had once meant something in Cedar Hollow. Old Silas Hayes had run that trading post for nearly 20 years before the railroad bypassed the settlement, and the building was shuttered, left to rot under 3 decades of dust and silence. Nobody wanted it. Nobody had wanted it in years. Friday came, and Eleanor stood in the small crowd gathered outside the county office, the only bidder who raised her hand when the auctioneer called the property. $2, the clerk said, sliding the paper across the counter afterward, his tone somewhere between confusion and pity. "You'd be better off keeping the $2, Mrs. Hayes. There's nothing out there but a building falling down around itself." She paid it anyway. It wasn't sentiment that drove her. Not really. Not yet. It was the simple fact that she had nowhere else to go, and a roof, even a collapsing one, was still a roof. The Hayes relatives who had turned her away hadn't even bothered to attend the auction. Why would they? In their eyes, the trading post was worthless, just like the woman now preparing to walk 3 miles out of town to claim it. The walk took longer than she expected, the road out of Cedar Hollow turning to little more than a rutted track once the last houses fell behind her. By the time the trading post came into view, the late afternoon sun had turned the sky the color of weak tea, and Eleanor's arms ached from the weight of the trunk. The building sat at the edge of a dry creek bed, its sign long faded, the painted letters, Hayes Trading Post, EST, barely visible beneath decades of sun-bleached gray. The porch had collapsed on one side, the boards sagging toward the earth like something exhausted. Half the windows were boarded over with warped planks, the other half were simply gone, leaving black holes that stared back at her like empty eyes. She stood at the edge of the property for a long moment before approaching, the way one might stand at the edge of a grave. An old man on horseback passed along the road behind her just then, slowing his horse as he took in the sight of a young woman alone with a trunk at the edge of the abandoned post. He was a rancher, by the look of his hands and the dust on his boots, someone who had likely passed this building 1,000 times without a second glance. "You're not thinking of staying out here, are you, ma'am?" he asked, not unkindly. "I bought it," Eleanor said simply. The man's eyebrows lifted. He studied her a moment longer, then the building, then shook his head slowly. "Folks say that place is unlucky. Silas Hayes died owing half the county money, and the building's been sitting empty so long even the rats moved on. You sure you want to spend a night in there?" "I don't have anywhere else to spend it," she said. He had no answer for that. He tipped his hat, murmured something about hoping she'd be all right, and rode on, to leaving her alone with the wind and the dust, and the long shadow of the building stretching out toward her like it was reaching. She pushed open the door. It groaned against rusted hinges, releasing 30 years of trapped, stale air into the evening light, dust, old wood, and something faintly metallic underneath, like the building itself remembered being touched by hands long gone. Inside, the post looked frozen in time. A long wooden counter ran along the back wall, its surface still cluttered with the ghosts of old commerce, a rusted brass scale, a few cracked glass jars that might once have held candy or tobacco, a ledger book swollen thick with old water damage, its cover curled and gray. Shelves lined the walls, most of them collapsed, their contents scattered and rotted across the floor in heaps that crunched faintly under her boots. It smelled of dust and mildew, and beneath that, something older, something like cold ash, the smell of a fire that had gone out a very long time ago and never been lit again. She found a corner relatively clear of debris and laid out her bedroll there, too tired and too numb to do more that first night than sweep a small space clean. She did not light a fire. She simply lay in the dark, listening to the wind move through the broken windows like something breathing, and for the first time since Thomas's death, she found she was too exhausted even to cry. Sleep, when it came, was thin and restless. The next morning, sunlight came through the gaps in the boarded windows in thin gold lines, cutting bright bars across the dust-choked air, and Eleanor began to clean. It was instinct more than plan. She had no money for repairs, no clear idea of what she would do with a dead trading post in a dying part of town, no certainty that she would even stay past the week, but she could not sit still in grief, and sweeping the floor gave her hands something to do besides shake. She worked through the morning, hauling out broken shelving, sweeping decades of dust and droppings into the yard, salvaging what little was worth salvaging. A few intact glass jars, the brass scale, which only needed cleaning to look almost new again. By midday, the front room had taken on something almost like order, and for the first time since the funeral, Eleanor felt something other than grief sitting in her chest. It was small, and she didn't trust it yet, but it was there. It was while clearing debris from behind the long counter, dragging out a collapsed shelf that had fallen against the back wall, that she noticed something odd. The counter itself was old but solid. A thick slab of oak, clearly built to last. The kind of craftsmanship that suggested Silas Hayes had cared more for this one piece of furniture than for anything else in the building. Behind it, however, the wall did not match the rest of the structure. While the surrounding walls were rough-hewn log, chinked with old clay and moss, this section directly behind the counter was bricked. Smooth, deliberate, mortared with a precision that made no sense for a hastily built frontier trading post. She stood staring at it for a long moment, broom forgotten in her hand. Brick was not cheap. Not out here, not 40 years ago. Someone had gone to considerable trouble and expense to build this single section of wall differently from everything around it, and gone to even more trouble to make sure it didn't draw attention. Tucked as it was behind a counter no casual visitor would have reason to look behind. She crossed the room and ran her hand along the brick. It was cooler than the surrounding wood, the way stone always was. But there was something else too. A faint unevenness near the base, almost hidden beneath where the fallen shelf had been resting. One brick sat very slightly recessed from the others, its mortar lines thinner, less weathered, as though it had been removed and replaced more than once over the years. Eleanor knelt down, her heart beginning to beat a little faster than the work alone could explain, and pressed her palm flat against it. It moved, not much, barely a fraction of an inch, but enough. Enough to tell her this was not simply old, settled mortar shifting with the building's age. This brick had been meant to come loose. Someone had built it that way on purpose. Before she could pull at the brick further, something else caught her eye. The swollen ledger book still sitting on the counter above her. The one she'd assumed was ruined beyond any use, its cover warped and gray with old water damage. She stood, lifting it carefully, intending only to move it aside to clear more space for whatever work the brick wall would require. But as she shifted the heavy book, a folded paper slipped loose from between its damaged, fused pages and fell to the floor, landing face down at her feet. It had clearly been placed there deliberately, tucked deep enough into the ledger's pages that the water damage around it had never quite reached the paper itself. Eleanor knelt and picked it up, her fingers trembling slightly as she unfolded it. The ink had faded to a pale brown, but the handwriting was still legible, careful, deliberate, the kind of script a man takes time over when he means every word of it. To whoever finds this, Silas Hayes built more into these walls than goods to sell. What's behind the counter belongs to family, and family alone. Trust no Hayes who asks for the location, only the one who finds it herself. If you are reading this, you have already done what none of them ever bothered to do. Eleanor read the note twice, then a third time, her pulse quickening with each pass over the words. None of them ever bothered to do. She thought of Robert Hayes, of Thomas's aunt, of the whole comfortable, settled Hayes family, who had let her walk out of town with a single trunk, rather than offer her so much as a spare room. They had grown up knowing this trading post existed, knowing it had once belonged to their own grandfather, and not one of them had ever come looking. Not one of them had ever cared enough. To them, this place had simply been worthless, a piece of family history not worth the trouble of claiming. She looked back at the brick, the note still clutched tight in her hand, and felt something shift inside her, grief giving way, just slightly, to something sharper, something closer to purpose. It took her the better part of an hour, working with a broken fire poker pried loose from the rubble as a makeshift tool, chipping carefully at the mortar around the loose brick. Her hands blistered, dust caught in her throat. Twice she stopped, certain she'd imagined the whole thing, certain she was simply a grieving young widow digging at a wall for no reason at all. But the brick kept giving, fraction by fraction, until finally it tumbled loose entirely, dropping to the floor with a hollow thud that seemed to echo through the empty building. Eleanor knelt in front of the opening, the late afternoon light barely reaching this far behind the counter, and peered into the darkness. It was not a single hiding space, she realized, but a narrow cavity that ran the length of the counter itself, clearly built with real intention, not improvised in haste. Someone had planned this carefully, years before, brick by careful brick. She reached inside, her fingers brushing first against cobweb and grit, and then against something cold and solid, metal. She worked it loose and pulled it out into the light, a small iron strongbox, rusted heavily at the hinges but still intact, its lid sealed shut with age rather than any lock. It took both hands and considerable effort to finally pry it open, the hinges shrieking in protest after 30 years of stillness. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had somehow, against all odds, kept the worst of the damp at bay, she found gold coins, not a fortune by the standards of the great mining claims further west. Not enough to make her wealthy in any grand sense, but more money than Eleanor had ever held in her life at one time. Enough, certainly, to rebuild what had collapsed. Enough to survive the coming winter, and likely the one after that as well. She sat back on her heels, coins spilling slightly from her shaking hands, and allowed herself for just a moment to simply breathe. But beneath the coins, tucked at the very bottom of the strongbox, was something that mattered even more. A second, smaller bundle of papers, tied with brittle string. Land deeds. Not for the trading post itself, which she already held, but for 3 separate parcels of land, running along the creek beyond the building, each registered in Silas Hayes's name decades earlier, and as far as Eleanor could tell from the careful notations, never transferred, sold or claimed by anyone since his death. The Hayes family who had cast her out had no idea this land existed. It had simply vanished from memory, filed away and forgotten in a county office nobody had thought to check. Hidden behind a trading post, nobody had wanted enough to even look inside. Eleanor sat there a long while, the gold and the deeds spread across her lap, the dust still settling around her in the fading light, and understood, perhaps for the first time since Thomas's death, that she was no longer entirely without resources. She was no longer entirely without a future. She was, however, about to have a problem. Because words, she knew, would not stay quiet for long. Eleanor did not rush back into town the next morning waving gold coins for all to see. Whatever grief had dulled her instincts in the days following Thomas's death, this discovery had sharpened them again, quick and clear. Instead, she walked the 3 miles back to Cedar Hollow alone, the strongbox left hidden, and went directly to the county recorder's office, not the clerk who had sold her the trading post, but the older recorder, a quiet, exacting man named Mr. Whitfield, who had kept the county's land records for nearly 30 years, and was known above all for his discretion. She laid the 3 land deeds on his desk, without explanation of how she'd come to have them. Whitfield studied them for a long while, adjusting his spectacles, running a finger down each document with the slow care of a man who took his work seriously. "These are genuine," he said finally. "Silas Hayes's parcels, filed properly. Taxes paid through the year he died. Never transferred, never sold. By rights," he paused, glancing up at her. "By rights, whoever holds these deeds now owns that land outright. No further claim required. And the ownership," Eleanor said carefully, "it transfers with the deed itself. Not through the family name?" "Land law doesn't care much for family name, Mrs. Hayes," Whitfield said, not unkindly. "It cares for paper. Whoever holds the deed holds the land." He studied her a moment longer, something like understanding passing behind his eyes. "I take it you found these out at the old trading post." She didn't answer directly. "Is there any reason the Hayes family would have a claim to contest this?" "Not unless they can produce earlier paper than what you're holding," Whitfield said. "And from what I understand, nobody in that family has set foot near that trading post in years." He stamped the documents, recording the transfer of recognition into her name with the same unhurried care he'd given to reading them. "Whatever you found out there, Mrs. Hayes, I'd say it's rightfully yours." She left his office with the deeds properly registered, the gold still hidden, and a quiet, careful satisfaction settling into her chest. The first thing close to security she had felt in weeks. It did not last long. Word traveled fast in a town the size of Cedar Hollow. Even about a woman everyone had assumed would quietly disappear. By the time Eleanor returned to the trading post, news of her visit to the recorder's office had already begun making its way through the usual channels. The barber, the general store, the church social, each retelling, adding a little more shine to whatever she'd supposedly found. It was Thomas's uncle, Robert Hayes, who arrived at the trading post 3 days later, his wagon kicking up dust on the dry road, his expression already arranged into something between concern and entitlement. Eleanor was out front, replacing a section of the collapsed porch railing, when she heard the wagon approach. She didn't stop working as he drew near. "Eleanor," he said, not bothering to dismount, "we heard you've been doing some work out here, clearing things out, and we heard you paid a visit to Whitfield's office in town." She set down her hammer slowly, wiping her hands on her apron, before turning to face him fully. "I did. This land." Robert gestured broadly toward the creek beyond the building, toward parcels he had likely never once walked in his life. "It was Hayes' land, originally. Family property. Going back to my father. Seems only right that whatever's found here stays in the family." His eyes moved past her to the trading post itself, lingering at the doorway, as though he could see straight through the walls to whatever she'd uncovered. Eleanor felt something settle in her chest, cold and very clear. They had let her walk away with nothing. They had let her bury her husband, and leave town without a single offer of help, a single spare room, a single kind word. And now, the moment there was something to be gained, suddenly she was family again. "I bought this trading post for $2 at the county auction," she said evenly. "Same as anyone in this town could have, including you, Robert. Nobody bid against me. The deed has my name on it, and my name alone." His jaw tightened, his easy manner cooling by degrees. "There may be older papers, claims that predate yours. The Hayes name carries certain rights to property that's been in the family. Then I suppose," Eleanor said, her voice steady despite the way her hands had begun to tremble at her sides, "you should have looked for those papers before you let me leave town with nothing but a trunk and 2 dresses. You had years to come out here and look, Robert. None of you ever did. It was easier to let it sit and rot than to bother." He had no immediate answer for that. He sat his horse a moment longer, jaw working, clearly weighing whether further argument would gain him anything. "This isn't finished," he said finally, turning his wagon back toward town. "We'll see what the courts make of it." "I imagine we will," Eleanor said quietly, and went back to her hammer. Robert Hayes did try, in the weeks that followed, to make good on his threat, filing an inquiry with the county court, hinting at older family claims he was never quite able to produce. But Silas's note, the original purchase records of the trading post itself, and the clean properly registered chain of ownership on the 3 land deeds left him with no real legal ground to stand on. Mr. Whitfield, when called to testify before the circuit judge, stated plainly that the deeds were genuine, properly filed, and that no prior claim existed anywhere in the county's records. The land had been Eleanor's the moment she paid $2 for a building nobody else had wanted badly enough to even look inside. The judge dismissed the matter within a single afternoon. Eleanor used a portion of the gold to repair the trading post properly, rebuilding the collapsed porch, replacing the broken windows pane by pane, restocking the shelves with goods freighted in from the railhead. She kept the rest, along with the deeds to the 3 parcels along the creek, carefully set aside against whatever future might come. Within the year the trading post was open for business again, the only one for 15 miles in either direction, exactly as it had been in old Silas Hayes's time. Though run now by a woman the town had once been so quick to write off entirely. The 3 parcels of land she didn't sell. She held on to them, leasing 2 to local ranchers for grazing and keeping the 3rd along the creek bend for herself, where she eventually built a small house of her own, modest but solid, built to last the way the old trading post counter had been built to last. Cedar Hollow, in time, came to know her not as Thomas Hayes's widow, cast out and quietly forgotten, but simply as Eleanor Hayes, proprietor of the trading post, landholder in her own right, and the only person in the county who'd ever managed to outbargain the Hayes family at their own game, using nothing but $2 and the patience to look a little harder than anyone else had ever bothered to. Robert Hayes, for his part, never again brought up the matter of family rights in her presence. He had no further grounds to, and Eleanor, by then, had no further need of anything the Hayes name could offer her. She had built her own,